Good morning from Costa Rica. Thanks for joining us both in person and online. This next In Conversation segment is led by Brett Solomon, Executive Director of Access Now, and he'll be speaking with Doreen Bogdan Martin, Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union. At the ITU, she has pushed for digital applications to promote economies, jobs, and socio-economic inclusion. She also thinks about how connectivity can promote gender equality and how it can combat climate change. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, Doreen. Welcome to RightsCon. It's so great to have you here. You're actually the first ITU Secretary General that we've hosted at RightsCon, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Brett. Thank you.
And congratulations also on perhaps not such a new position now, but your appointment as Secretary General. Can you give us a sense of, your first 100 days, what you've learned? How's that informing your approach to this role?
Sure. Thank you. So my first 100 days, which I would say sort of flew by, were laser focused on trying to build a fit for future ITU. I think, as you well know, our mission and mandate to connect the world, even though we're 158 years old, has never been more important. So I really spent those first 100 days focusing on how to achieve an institution that inspires, that includes, and that innovates. So lots of internal focus on trying to understand where we are, where are the gaps, how can we achieve an institution of excellence, and of course, at the same time, focusing externally, focusing on strengthening our strategic engagements with UN partners, with civil society, academia, governments, private sector, and trying to make sure that the voice of the ITU is heard. And as you know, digital issues are topping agendas everywhere. Everywhere, including, of course, at the UN system. So I think it's important that the ITU and our mandate is clearly understood and identified.
Yeah. One of the issues that you mentioned there is about connectivity, and thanks a lot for that. I always love the ITU's, our ability to be able to access a lot of the data from the ITU. And one of the statistics that we have is that, not such a happy one, I guess, is that 2.7 billion people, give or take, are not on the internet, are not connected. And even worse is that the majority of those people are actually women and girls. I know that this is a pet issue, an important issue for you personally. And I'd like to get a sense from you, what do you think are the reasons for this? I mean, are we just sort of replicating patriarchy in the online environment? And what is preventing us from ensuring that we really do have meaningful connectivity for all of us?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and I'm happy you mentioned meaningful, because at the end, that's what it's all about. It's not just the connection, it's what you can do with the connection. And when we look at the numbers, the 2.7 billion people that have never, ever accessed the internet, and as you said, the majority being women and girls, I think there's sort of no silver bullet to extending connectivity and to tackling the digital divide. It's a combination of factors. Of course, it's the affordability issue. It's the cost. In many ways, it's too expensive, in particular for the world's poorest. There's a big literacy component, digital literacy, digital skills, that prevents women and girls from being able to benefit from their connectivity. There's also safety issues, which we saw during the pandemic. Online bullying and harassment of women and girls increased. And so in some cases, women and girls are actually afraid to go online. Of course, there's content issues. Is the content relevant? Is it available in local languages? So those are the kinds of issues that we see. I think the good news, if there is good news on this issue, is that the UN Commission on the Status of Women actually focused on this issue this year. That was the theme for CW.
Yeah, great.
And I think we did get some good conclusions on the importance of finance for inclusion, digital inclusion, to also zooming in on the policies, having gender responsive policies, making sure that technology design, development, and deployment are also gender responsive. So I think that helps. But when I look at, I was just going to say, when I look at the work that the ITU has done, we've been focused on this. It was 25 years ago this year that we actually had our first resolution at a conference on gender. And I think we've made some progress, including women's participation in the sector, but I don't think we can celebrate it. I think we have to do much more to make targeted interventions to close the digital gender gap.
Yeah, thank you. And I think many civil society groups have been focused on this issue for a long time, for 25 years or more. But it sort of feels like it's an extra special problem, right? It takes extra special analysis and niche responses. And as I say, a long way to go. I mean, 2.7 billion people is just like an unfathomable amount, given the fact that technology now has become such an inherent part, as you say at the beginning, in everything and everybody's lives, which makes it all the more curious why governments are at times shutting off the internet. And, you at the ITU and you yourself, Secretary General, have talked about how the internet is so essential as a life-saving platform, particularly in times of crisis. We saw 187 internet shutdowns in 35 countries last year. Access Now runs the Keep It On Coalition, which has about 300 NGOs in it. But we're increasingly seeing connectivity issues, intentional disruptions of the network at times of crisis. So how do we deliver, or maybe how do you deliver a message from the ITU that internet access is actually a humanitarian issue now? It's a saving life issue, particularly in times of crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Internet access does save lives. And I think the internet is a uniquely powerful enabler for the Sustainable Development Goals and, as you mentioned, of course, for human rights. I think when we look back, and Brett, you'll remember the World Summit on the Information Society, it was pretty clear, even back in 2003, as part of the outcome document where world leaders came together, that the WSIS principles to bring an information society for all uphold the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need to think about that. We need to keep that at the core. Our approach is grounded in human rights, and the ITU urges every country to provide its citizens with as broad an access to the means of communications as possible. I think that's in line with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and of course the ITU Constitution. It does carry, let's say, specific duties and responsibilities, such as the respect of the rights or reputations of others and protection of national security or public order, as are provided by law and, of course, as are necessary. We continue to advocate for digital connectivity and internet access for all people everywhere, regardless of their means. We think it's critical that all voices are heard, that all voices are respected. And again, we also see this as core to the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And when it comes to times of crisis, we've seen a number of unfortunate natural disasters, and we know how important access to communications, early warning systems can actually save lives, as you mentioned in the beginning.
Thank you. Yeah, this again is another kind of vexing problem that we are still trying to solve through, as a result of civil society's work on it, but also institutions like the ITU, is that the issue of connectivity, particularly when there's humanitarian crises at play, means that it's not just human rights law that needs to apply, it's also international humanitarian law. And we've seen the consequences, of course, with natural disasters, as you say, but also when we have man-made crises like we're seeing in Ukraine, for instance, where there's been intentional blowing up and destruction of infrastructure, which of course I know is of concern to the ITU, not just in that country but in others. You mentioned the SDGs, and thanks a lot, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think when they were passed, it felt like 2030 was a long way away. It's not, right? I mean, it's just around the corner. And one of those SDGs is about environmental sustainability and climate. And there seems to be, sometimes the SDGs are kind of not in conflict with each other, but there's tension. So we're calling for connectivity for everybody, meaningful connectivity. But that means new devices, it needs billions of new devices, and also old devices are ending up in landfill. Also means there's further pressure on, on data centers, which means more creation of carbon. And I'm wondering, how do you kind of reconcile that? At RightsCon this year, there's a particular focus on the climate crisis, bringing the power of the digital rights movement to the climate crisis. So I'm really interested in your perspective on this.
Well, I love this question because I think it reflects the ITU's entire strategy for the next 4 years. When we had our last plenipotentiary conference last year, the member states gave us a twofold mandate: universal connectivity and sustainable digital transformation. And of course, in terms of this question, emphasis on the sustainable piece. When we look at the connectivity piece that we discussed previously, we have an understanding of what needs to be done, the investment challenges that are presented, and we've put together something that you have followed closely, which is our Partner to Connect digital coalition. And when it comes to the sustainable digital transformation piece, I would say I'm encouraged because our membership is very focused on the sustainability piece. We've been working on science-based targets and technical standards, looking at green digital and ways that we can work with our sector to actually reduce our sector's greenhouse gas emissions. The e-waste piece is a huge one, in particular for developing countries. So we've been working with, I would say all countries, but in particular developing countries, to help them put in place e-waste policies, e-waste management facilities, so that they can develop this circular economy, which we think is so necessary. You mentioned the focus at RightsCon that you will be taking on this issue. We will also be having a much more active presence and participation at COP28. I think it's critical that we focus on green digital. So we're looking forward to working with you and other partners to make a strong showing and a strong case at COP28 of what our sector can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's excellent. And I look forward to working with you on that. There's so many points of intersection with climate and technology now. And I think many governments are kind of, talking about technology as the answer, or a large part of the answer. I think we need to be a little skeptical of that as well. We need to think about, about reduction really of carbon emissions, about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, not necessarily about, technology-driven sequestration. But I'm really glad to hear that there'll be a strong showing of the ITU at COP28, which is the climate change conference, the UN climate change conference. We also, we've been involved in COP for a few years now, because we've been also focused on the fact that environmental defenders and climate change actors are often also at risk from their online activities. And so we see on the helpline, I think it's about 15% of cases that come through our helpline are individuals who are trying to protect their land, their forests, responding to mining companies, et cetera, under technical attack, which is a whole nother thing that we'd never really thought of. I wanted to, I know we've got limited time and there's a couple more questions I'd like to ask you. One is about satellite internet. And I think many of us have started now, or many of us have been working on this for a number of years, but it's really now in the popular kind of zeitgeist that that satellite internet is available and is also really quite accessible. Of course, there's the risk of satellites, crashing in space. And I know that the ITU has been involved in this, not the crashing, but they're trying to avoid the crash between some of the satellites. Give me a sense of like some of your early thinking on low Earth orbit satellites for communication and how different stakeholders can and are participating in that effort.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time for space and for the satellite industry as a whole. I think with this with the sort of new fleets of LEO satellite systems, I think it offers tremendous opportunities to connect the unconnected. Of course, at the end, there will always be a blend of technologies from terrestrial, wireless, satellite. But I think there's a lot of opportunities that we can leverage from the LEO systems. I think they will be a game changer, that they offer developing countries an opportunity to connect quickly, to be able to scale up connectivity internally, also across borders. We're trying to leverage some of the new excitement in space in the context of our school connectivity program that we're advancing with UNICEF, our GIGA effort to connect every school in the world to the internet. But as you mentioned, I mean, there's lots of issues to be considered in the exciting things happening in space. ITU has been involved in space for many years, as we are responsible not just for the satellite orbital positioning, but also the allocation of the communications related frequencies to those satellites. So we're looking at a number of issues. We have a new resolution on Space 2030, looking at sustainability issues. I know there's a lot of discussion on space debris, space traffic management. We're working with UNOSA in the UN system, as the UN Secretary General is also quite focused on this issue and has called for a space dialogue in the context of next year's Summit of the Futures. So we're excited. We know there's a lot of issues, but I think there are also many opportunities.
Can I just ask you a side question on that in relation to how you at the ITU are managing the private sector, or how the relationship with the private sector has evolved now that the private sector is has invested so heavily in satellites at the LEO level?
Yeah, well, as you know, ITU has an interesting membership composition. I think it makes us quite unique. We have our 193 member states, but we also have well over 800 private sector members, many of which are the satellite operators, or those engaged in the satellite industry. So we work with them directly on a number of initiatives. Many of them have made specific commitments in the context of our Partner to Connect pledging platform. But when it comes to things like filings, for example, satellite filings, because of our radio regulations and our other procedures, go through a member state. So, of course, we'll always have member state engagement, but we're very happy that we're working, I would say, with the majority of space players.
And when you talk about membership, I think it's also good to think about the evolution of the ITU as well, in terms of its relationship with civil society, and how, access can be gained to some of the information that's generally, sort of part of the ITU discussions for members and for some of the companies as delegates, but also expanding that as broadly as possible to civil society. And, we've talked about that in the past. I have one last question for you, which is about, of course, generative AI, obviously the topic of the du jour. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've seen in your tenure at the ITU an evolution of technologies, and obviously the ITU since 1865 has seen technologies come and go. I know that there's a focus from the ITU on some of the positives through, your AI for Good initiative and the global summit that's coming up on some of the things that we've talked about, like climate crisis and bolstering humanitarian response. But we're also hearing a lot on the doomsday scenarios as well. And I'm just interested in your own personal thoughts about this moment in time. Like, how big a deal is this? How significant is it? How important is it, not just for the people who are assembled at RightsCon, but for the entire global community to be engaged with this? I'm really interested in to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal, and you know that, and I think there are tremendous opportunities if we get it right, but there are also big challenges and risks if we get it wrong. And as you know, I mean, from the G7 to the G20 to the UN, not a single forum goes by without having at least someone address generative AI and the need to do something. Of course, next year, in the context of the Summit of the Futures, there is this piece of the Global Digital Compact that's focused on AI. But I guess, can we wait until then? Things are moving so quickly. We do have our AI for Good Summit, as you alluded to. It comes up in July, back in person for the first time. And we will have many governments, some 40 UN agencies, and we will have discussions, because I think at this point, we need to keep talking. We need to keep engaging with the right stakeholders to find out what we can together do to ensure that the benefits of generative AI can flourish, and that we can mitigate potential risks and ensure that this is developed in a responsible manner.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just poses challenges for all of us. And I was thinking, actually, as I was listening to you, about the challenges that it poses to global governance institutions and what the response needs to be. And you've seen, obviously, calls for pauses in terms of large language model deployment and development. And you also, of course, raised the issue of the speed with which, not just the scope, but the speed with which we need to respond. I think there's many, many sessions, maybe 20 or 30 sessions here at RightsCon on AI. So we'll be sure to deliver you some of our thoughts and some of the thoughts from some of the experts who are present, which maybe can feed into your AI for Good Summit in July.
Can I just add something, Brett? When we think about what's happening in the AI space and the opportunities, the challenges, I always think it's important to balance it with the fact that 2.7 billion people have never ever connected, and the implications of furthering the divide. So as we address these issues and challenges around emerging and new tech, at the same time, we have to be faster on connecting the unconnected, because otherwise the divide's bigger and harder to close. Yeah,
and let me just respond to that as well, because it is true that, we have these 2.7 billion people who are disconnected, but not only are they disconnected, they also don't have a say in the technologies that are being developed at the other end of the spectrum, and yet will probably be impacted the most. And we think about, government and also corporate investment. Which end of the spectrum are we investing in, and making sure that we bring up that group of of folks, the marginalised, the dispossessed, the migrants, asylum seekers, you name it, Indigenous folks, women who aren't able to even enter the digital sphere yet. Before we start. But again, that's a hope. I don't think we can even think about it now in terms of, we need to respond in real time. And so thank you very much for being with us. Thanks for your time. We look forward to, I know that there are a number of representatives from the ITU who are at RightsCon, which is great. So people should look out for them. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Brett. A pleasure. Thanks.